Welcome back to the channel, folks. My name is Finn Dwyer. I'm an Irish historian and I'm also the creator of the Irish History podcast. And in this video, we're going to journey all the way back to Britain in the late 1940s and look at the contribution that tens of thousands of Irish immigrants made to what's regarded as one of Britain's greatest achievements of the later 20th century, that's the NHS. So if we take the story back to the late 1940s, Britain had emerged victorious in the Second World War, but the conflict had really cost Britain heavily. A lot of British cities remained bombed out, while the country was still under rationing. A lot of daily goods were still severely curtailed. But it was in this climate that the British government of the late 1940s created the National Health Service. It was a free public health service that would go on to become the pride of British people right throughout the 20th century. Even today you hear the NHS or the National Health Service brought up in political debates time and again. But what's often left out of the story of the NHS is that it was actually built by immigrants, and among those immigrants, the Irish who moved to Britain in the 1940s were among the largest group to help build the NHS. Indeed, by the 1960s, over 10% of the entire workforce of the NHS had come from Ireland. That was over 30,000 people. And in this video, I interview Professor Louise Ryan, who co-authored the book on Irish contributions to the NHS, about these women who journeyed across to Britain in the late 1940s to work in the NHS and help build Britain's public health service. It's a really fascinating conversation that looks at the experience of these women, how these Irish immigrants built what's often regarded as one of Britain's great achievements, the racism they faced, and the impact of the Troubles on them. Louise is a really fascinating speaker, so I think you're really going to enjoy this. If you want to get her book, it's linked beneath this video, and I also have a much longer interview in podcast format linked there below. But to start the interview, I asked Louise about the numbers of Irish people who went to Britain to help build the NHS and why Britain needed so many immigrants in the aftermath of the Second World War.
So right from day one, from 1948, when the National Health Service was first established, it was very quickly apparent that they just did not have enough staff to work in the hospitals. They were massively expanding the provision of services and they didn't have the staff available. So right from day one, they started to recruit overseas workers. And in the book, we have advertisements from actually the Cork Examiner from 1949, where National Health Service hospitals in Britain are advertising in Irish provincial and national newspapers looking to attract student nurses. So you didn't even have to be trained. You could apply as an 18-year-old. You had to be over 18 to come over to Britain, and then you would work as you trained. So it was sort of an apprenticeship model at the time, which opened it up, of course, to far bigger numbers of people, because you could arrive with absolutely zero nurse training and then start from scratch and train as you went along, also working while you trained. So they were getting recruits really from point zero to work and then work their whole careers in the NHS. So then in terms of numbers, we know that huge proportions of workers coming into work, especially as nurses, were from overseas. The Irish would have been the first and the biggest to arrive from the late 40s onwards. And so with this continual wave of Irish migrants, particularly women arriving by the late 1960s, it's estimated that about 30,000 Irish-born nurses were working across the NHS, and at the time they constituted around 11% of nurses.
Obviously, they're all going over to train as nurses, but the book highlights that English women don't really want to do this, or it's an unattractive career. And I think some of this can become apparent when the women that you've interviewed are talking about the training regime. Can you talk a bit about what that, initial stage of the training in the hospitals was like? And maybe it kind of goes some way to maybe explaining why English women weren't drawn into the profession and why so many immigrants stepped into the breach at that point.
Yes, absolutely. It was not a particularly glamorous profession by any stretch of the imagination. And in contrast to Ireland, where there were very few career options for women, at that time in Britain, there was a burgeoning of career options for young women, especially There was factory work, which was often better paid than some other occupations. But there were also a lot of office jobs, clerical work, secretarial work, work in shops, receptionists. There were various jobs that British women could do. So they had more choice. And nursing, as you said, was a very hard job. It was not a particularly well paid job. And the hours were long, night shifts, weekend work, quite antisocial, especially for young single girls who might want to be going out at the weekends, enjoying themselves. So, for all of those reasons, nursing did not appeal very much to young British women, which is why there was such a heavy reliance on migrant workers.
But you get the sense from the book, there's a real sense of solidarity builds up between these Irish nurses and women drawn from all across the world. Some of them come back to Ireland on holidays with their friends. Can you talk a little bit about the diversity of the workplace in the NHS? Because again, that was kind of I think, a different aspect to what many of these women would surely have expected based on their kind of experiences and understanding of British life through the media.
Yes, absolutely. And again, they had these encounters with people from all over the world. And some of them said, I'd never met a black person before until the very first day I arrived at the hospital. So they were encountering people from a huge range of cultures, languages, cuisines, and food was mentioned a lot. And they were mixing together as colleagues on the hospital ward. But of course, they were also living together in the nurse's home. And that's when they really got to know each other very well in the nurse's home. And many of them talked about cooking, sharing food, discovering spicy food for the first time, which they'd never tasted before, sharing Irish food with people from other parts of the world who had the audacity to suggest that maybe bacon and cabbage was a bit bland when people were used to much spicier food. And one of the nurses tells the story of sharing bacon and cabbage with some of her Malaysian nursing colleagues. And then she could see that they were sort of shaking some herbs and spices on it to try to give it more flavor. And she was highly insulted by that. So we have these lovely encounters over food. But it was quite a leveling experience, of course, because they were all student nurses together. They were all starting from zero. They were all in the same position. They were all away from home. They all felt a sense of confusion, cultural shock, disorientation, loneliness. And so that was probably unique.
In the late 20th century, there's been waves of racism that have kind of taken hold in British society. We can see it again in the 21st century. And all these groups, obviously working in the NHS, were subjected to racism. But anti-Irish racism also has a long history in Britain. Reading the book, it seems to have depended on where people were. Liverpool was deemed to be kind of a more friendly city. There are very negative accounts of London in the 1940s. Can you talk maybe about the general experience of the racism these Irish nurses faced?
Yeah, one of the things that really emerged from the book were the different experiences of racism. So some nurses said they never encountered any problem at all. And they kind of minimized any bad experiences. And of course, when you're doing oral history research, you are inviting people to share their stories and you are valuing their stories. So when they then say things that you're not expecting them to say, or when they're saying things that you feel, oh, okay, I'm a bit surprised by that, you have to respect that is their experience, that is their story. So when some of them were saying, no, I never, ever experienced anything, I was surprised by that, but appreciated and respected their opinion. But what was fascinating was how often later on in the interview, they would then relate an incident that had occurred. And you're sort of thinking, but that was an incident of anti-Irish prejudice, surely. But people tended to make light of it, some people. So that was fascinating that people were having these experiences of, people making fun of their accents, people sort of taking the piss out of them or sending them up in a way, or getting them to say particular words like 33 and a third, just to sort of see would they drop their H's. And you thought, yeah, but actually that is an example of racism, but people didn't perceive it that way. There is a narrative that anti-Irish racism in Britain was very much linked to IRA bombs and the Troubles. But clearly it has a long history and it very much predates what was going on in terms of the Troubles. So hearing people talk about their experiences in the 50s, it is very revealing and illuminating. So it was very powerful to hear those stories as well.
Then I suppose that leads on to the impact of the Troubles. While anti-Irish racism obviously predates the late 60s, early 70s, the Troubles did have an impact, and the conflict in general did have an impact, and an impact on the way Irish people in general were viewed. Maybe certain prejudices and stereotypes are brought to the fore. You know, maybe you can see it certainly in the earlier 20th century, the idea that the Irish being violent can come to the fore, and then conflict can bring that out. But can you talk a bit about how these Irish nurses in the NHS were impacted by the outbreak of the conflict?
Yes, and I think we have a whole chapter in the book about that. And some of the stories that the nurses shared with us, I had never in my 20 odd years doing research on Irish migrants in Britain, I'd never heard those particular stories before. So I think we have uncovered a very important part of that narrative. And that's why oral history, with that older generation who are, not going to be with us forever, collecting those stories is so vital because we're always hearing something new that hasn't been heard before. So what was so powerful in the book about the impact of the Troubles was the way in which it changed relationships, including long established relationships, how they just flipped around the time of the Troubles, especially when a bomb went off in a particular local area. So we have several stories of nurses saying that they had been nursing a particular patient for ages. The patient knew them, they knew the patient well. These were often people with long-term conditions, for example, district nurses who would have been going in and visiting a patient over a protracted period of time. And then suddenly a bomb would go off, and that patient would just turn on that Irish nurse, because in that moment, her Irishness became the dominant factor in her identity. The fact that she was a known and trusted professional who'd been providing care perhaps for months was eclipsed by the fact that in that moment, she was an Irish person and she was sort of guilty by association, if you want to use that phrase. So we have several examples of that. It wasn't just one or two. We have several in the book where nurses said a patient would suddenly turn around to them and say, I don't want you. Can somebody else come? I'm not comfortable with you now because you're Irish or because of what your crowd did yesterday. So that, again, being lumped together. So this was really powerful because we hear how very skilled professionals who are wearing a uniform, who are doing a professional job. These are not random Irish people on the street who are suddenly being attacked by strangers. These are professionals wearing a uniform, doing a vital job, providing healthcare to somebody who's ill, and yet the patient is turning on them and sending them away because they're Irish.
Now, I found that conversation really fascinating. You can buy Louise's book at the link below. I also have a much longer conversation with Louise in podcast format linked there from the Irish History podcast. We go into much greater detail about the experiences of the Irish women and what it was like working in the NHS. There's really great detail there as well. So you can find that linked below. I'll be back with a new video next week. Until then, slán.